And for a start, let me say that at the moment we have an effective law adopted in 1992, the law on national minorities in Ukraine, and everybody agrees that it is outdated. It has been like that for a while, and it needs to be changed. Another reason to adopt the new draft law is the following. In 2019, when voting and adopting the law on the Ukrainian language as the state language, April 19, 2019, in transitional and final provisions, it was stated that the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine, in the course of 6 months, when the law comes into effect, is to prepare and submit to the Parliament of Ukraine the draft law on the procedure of exercising rights of indigenous people and national minorities of Ukraine. The Cabinet of Ministers failed to do that. We discussed this at the hearings of our committee on July 8, and to implement the decision of the hearing, the committee voted to set up the working group to draft the new law on national minorities of Ukraine. I had this working group, and from day one I said that we are not going to adopt the law without discussing the draft law with the national minorities of Ukraine. It's really a very logical step. We need to listen to you, representatives of national minorities, and then vote the draft law into the law. We had numerous meetings. We had a set of monitoring visits and monitoring events. And here I see a lot of familiar faces, those people that participated in the meetings offline when we went to Donetsk to Donetsk Oblast on a visit. Next day we went to Melitopol, and we've seen intercultural locations in Melitopol. Many people came for this meeting. We had Odessa, Uman, Chernivtsi to follow. The last town we visited was Uzhhorod, Transcarpathians. These were the first monitoring visits, and members of the parliament are currently working on making sure that we conduct similar monitoring visits to other regions. That's what we are planning to do. Today, we have a chance for everybody to speak. Each of you will have 3 minutes, and please stick to the time frame. There are so many participants on this call, and that's why I couldn't join in timely, because the capacity of this call was already filled up. So we want to make sure that everybody has a chance to speak. So you have 3 minutes. As soon as 3 minutes expire, so the microphone will be turned off. So try to speak to the point, stay tolerant, and respect each other's positions and views. This draft law is sure to be politicized in the parliament. We are going to see lots of comments, critical comments, but it is the parliament that votes for the draft law, and we need 226 votes to vote the draft law into the law. So we need to search for compromise. Let me stress that the draft law is available on our website. It was put on the website on June 2 at 9 a.m. I promised to do it on the 1st. For technical reasons, we made it on June 2, and we have an email address. That's a dedicated email address for your comments, proposals, suggestions. As of today, 2.5 days later, we haven't received a single comment or suggestion or proposal. So I strongly encourage you to come up with your proposals. The deadline is moved over to June 7, we are going to have meetings with different institutions, agencies, and ministries. So I want to make sure that you are aware that the deadline is June 7. Main ideas of the draft law. I am not going to talk about general scenes. I am sure that you have read or will read it. As the head of the line committee, I want to make sure that you know the following. The authority that is designated to deal with the issues of national minorities, in our case, that's a state service on ethnic issues and freedom of conscience, is established by law. At the moment, that's the resolution of the Cabinet of Ministers that does that, and it can be quickly changed. So we decided that it should be part of the law. This authority should be properly funded in terms of the institution and in terms of the support it provides to national minorities. This should be part of the law as well. When it comes to the sums, procedures, the way expenditure should be made, all that should be governed by the resolution of the Cabinet of Ministers. It depends on economic situation. The better it is, the more money we'll have, but we want all this to be established by law. The next thing, this authority should have a consultative or advisory authority composed of representatives of NGOs of national minorities. It should be a permanent body. Next thing, that's the question that we got in the course of monitoring visits. The offices. We understand that under the law of Ukraine on the lease of state-owned and communally owned property, civil society organizations of national minorities don't have any privileges to get or to be entitled to get offices and premises for their work. This law, this draft law that we are currently discussing, we tried to find the proper approach to that. Lots of lawyers claim that we need a separate law to amend the effective law on the lease of state-owned and communally owned property. We decided that there should be provision under which I should have it printed out. Article 9 is amended, and we add paragraph 3, whereby associations of national minorities that are non-profit organizations and entered into the register of these organizations are entitled to lease state-owned and communally owned property without tenders under the procedure established by the law. That's going to be added, and that's going to be part of this draft law. As to the rest, it stays pretty much the same, and I'm happy to give the floor to the Parliament Commissioner for Human Rights, Lyudmila Denisova. And let me just add quickly that in the course of all monitoring visits, we had representatives of Ombudsman. We had them with us in all the regions. They are quick to respond to all the issues that national minorities bring up and attract their attention to. So I do appreciate that Lyudmila Denisova is with us today. Over to you. Thank you. Dear head of the committee, dear representatives of the international organizations, ambassadors, dear participants. According to the latest census in Ukraine, we have more than 10 million of persons that belong to national minorities. That's 130 nationalities. Back in 1997, when ratifying a framework convention on protection of national minorities, Ukraine undertook the obligations to undertake appropriate measures in all areas, economic, social, political, and cultural life to achieve full-fledged and authentic equality of persons belonging to national minorities and the majority of the population situation in the country. At a later stage, it was reconfirmed when we ratified the European Charter of Regional and Minority Languages in 2006. Ukraine undertook a serious obligation as to guarantees that should be provided to national minorities, but it cannot always secure that due to imperfect, effective national legislation. The law of Ukraine on national minorities of Ukraine of 1992 has a declarative nature of the principles and doesn't contain the mechanisms to guarantee that. And it is proved by the violations of the rights that the reports of which we receive. In the course of 5 months of this year, we received almost 23,000 of reports about human rights violations. Only 51 report, that's 0.2%, dealt with the rights of national minorities. What does that mean? It means that primarily these persons lack awareness and lack opportunities as to information where to go to protect their rights. In the course of monitoring visits, though, systemically, we identify the facts of violation of equality of national minorities when it comes to their access to social protection, healthcare, education, and free choice of the place of residence. We have numerous incidents of anti-Semitism and instigating national hatred. Attention to the rights of national minorities means not only restoring the rights that have been violated, but that includes preventive measures to make sure that the equality of national minorities is provided. Therefore, Ombudsman, along with the Council of Europe office in Ukraine, and international charity foundation, Roma Foundation Chirikli, had Kiev International Forum on Inclusivity of Roma, and that's the most vulnerable and marginalized national minority in Ukraine and Europe. The event was participated by 14 European institutions that work with the equality of national minorities. We approved the resolution to resort to positive actions to integrate Roma minority. For almost 30 years of being in effect, the current law on national minorities is outdated and does not allow for implementation of the rights and enforcement of the rights of national minorities. We need to update the effective law, so I appreciate and thank the Committee of the Parliament of Ukraine on Human Rights, and I appreciate the initiative of you, the Metro, for drafting a new law on national minorities in Ukraine. I believe that this document is comprehensive, and its provisions will contribute to provide for equality of national minorities and the majority of population Ukrainians, given international and European standards. Its implementation will allow to enforce the human rights of Ukrainian citizens and national minorities, and will contribute to the development of their ethnic identity, freedom of religion and speech, use of national language, and the right to participate in representative authorities. The additional provisions that were developed and the ideas that we collected in the course of monitoring visits, and these are the proposals of um, civil society organizations, we sort of processed them and translated them into the provisions that could be incorporated into the draft law. We'll pass them over to you after this law. Hopefully, this draft law will be supported by the Parliament. But it doesn't mean that that we should develop bylaws and respective legislation by the government to include national minorities. For the second year in a row, in cooperation with Roma community, we develop respective documents to protect Roma minority. I encourage Olena Bodnar and update us as to the state of work with this document that we submitted to you, because that's an important document. Today's event is extremely important to secure equality and all equal. I wish all of us interesting and a fruitful event. Thank you, Ludmila. We have representatives of central authority, executive authorities, that's Ministry of Culture, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Internal Affairs, National Police of Ukraine, and head of the State Service on Ethnic Policy and Freedom of Religion, Olena Bodnar.
Надам можливість прокоментувати, можливо, те, що ви сьогодні будете висловлювати. Отже, переходимо до...
Now, also we have here Mr. Taras Kremny. He's the Commissioner for the Protection of the State Language. And now we will give the floor to representatives of national minorities. Now the floor is given to Chair. Mr. Avanesyan Ashot, he's Chair of the Committee for National Minorities of Ukraine. Good afternoon, dear friends. Then Dmitry, I am very grateful to have this opportunity to speak at this council. And I would like to say that your fruitful work in different cities and towns of our Ukraine, discussing the law on national ethnic communities of Ukraine. I'm principally not going to use the word national minorities, but my colleagues, I hope, will support me. We are probably ethnic communities of Ukraine, not national minorities. We are very grateful for this fruitful work of the committee, and you as an MP having Uzhgorod, Melitopol, Odessa have visited various cities and towns. And maybe today is one of the last times when we discuss this new law on national ethnic communities of Ukraine. This is the first thing. Secondly, dear friends, I would like to say very briefly, without detailing on the paragraphs of the clauses of the articles and changes in them, I will speak concisely. It is very correct about the government structure. At the level of the Cabinet of Ministers, it shouldn't be the advisory body, but the level of Cabinet of Ministers to ensure funding of our organizations. Our NGOs do not compare us with other NGOs. We should have a separate status of a national and cultural community. This should be included in the law. Of course, we must have equal rights. We are we should have full rights as citizens of Ukraine. Our historic motherland, indigenous people. I think that indigenous people, since independence was declared in 1992, all ethnos existing in Ukraine should be indigenous people. We shouldn't be separating one from another. And of course, I would like to wish good, productive work today. Again, I was brief. 3 minutes is too little, too short, but anyways, I'm with you if there are questions. Thank you very much, dear friends. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ashot Dadikoevich. We are waiting your written comments. And dear colleagues, I will comment on what you are saying. During our initial committee hearings, I heard from you, and I support this idea that we should have changed definition from national minorities to national communities. But when we started working on this draft law, what we faced was that this definition is used according to international law. Secondly, it is included in the Constitution of Ukraine. And thirdly, in the Constitution of Ukraine, Part 1, it's specified there that, and this part could only be changed through a referendum procedure. And I, as an MP, cannot submit the terminology that would be contrary to the Constitution of Ukraine. And then this law may be recognized as acknowledged as countering the Constitution of Ukraine. And again, when we say national communities, we can use any definition, but unfortunately, this very definition is included in the international resolutions that Ukraine ratified. So it's used in the laws, and therefore we are going to use this national minority definition as for the using the communities, using national community, for example, what Ashot Dadikoevich has mentioned. You sent to us your comments, and we'll see how they can be used. As for indigenous people, you know that the president of Ukraine has submitted the law on the indigenous people, and we have raised this issue, but not all can be acknowledged as indigenous people. There is clear definition. It wasn't construed in Ukraine. This is a norm of international law that indigenous people can be acknowledged as those representatives who know their own motherland. The logic in the international law is that there should be a territory as a state establishment that develops the culture, development of language, traditions. If there is no such territory, then in the territory of the state where indigenous people inhabited by indigenous people, this should be the task of this territory. Therefore, in the law that was submitted, draft law submitted by the president, there were 3 national minorities determined that could be acknowledged as indigenous people. Therefore, with all respect to you, many of you have requested this, but if there is motherland, for example, then if there isn't a motherland, then or there is a motherland, then we have our legislation on the definition of indigenous people and acknowledgement of the indigenous people.
Будь ласка.
Доброго дня усім, щиро і сердечно
Good
вітаю.
afternoon to you. My trained greetings to you, all of you. We are grateful to our MP, Mr. Dmitry Valerievich, who chaired a number of these meetings where we discussed these problem issues. We have provided our comments. We can see that some of them, but not all of them, were included in the draft law. And I do support that we should be called ethnical communities. It is rather humiliated to be called national minority, while ethnical community would make all of us equal. What I like about the draft law, that there is a paragraph about the funding process, and that there should be an allocation in the budget included in a certain amount, so that in the cities, in the oblast level, and in the central the government level, there should be a decision that will enable us to use this provision. This is a very decisive, very important for us, that we have this funding support from the budget of Ukraine for national minorities and communities. That this state budget would support us. We will find other sources, but support from government authorities is very important for us. And we have a definition of national minority here. We suggested to have the definition of nation, people, title, nation, indigenous people, to have these definitions in this law, not only to have the definition of national minorities, also the areas of compact residents or inhabiting is not included in this law. The old law mentions that we could establish a national cultural autonomy, and it was removed from the old law, but never included, not included in this draft law. Moreover, we understand that with this national cultural autonomy, for example, if there is the law on indigenous people that is going to be voted for, then we need a law that will allow us to exercise our rights like indigenous people, for example, who will be funded, who will be able to have their own media. And this is a rather challenging issue for us. And maybe there should be the law on national cultural autonomy if you are not going to include this provision in this draft law, but it should exist in Ukraine. And we also suggested there was one very serious council under the president of Ukraine. At least once a year, we could meet and speak before the president in person, where we could share our problems, look into his eyes, and see how he communicates with us, whether he's interested in this issue, and whether he will look into it in more detail, considering that he has so many other issues. And the most challenging issue, the issue of nationality in the passport, where we suggested that if parents wish, for example, that in the entry of register of civil acts, for example, there will be an entry describing the nationality of a person. And also we would suggest that our committee conducts a national forum at least once in 2 or 3 years, that would bring people together, bring all peoples of Ukraine together. This is a comment to a committee. Thank you for your attention.
Іванівна, зразу коментую.
Thank you, Alexandra Ivanina. I would comment on this. Why didn't we include definition on indigenous people? Because an individual law has been submitted, and we decided that it doesn't make sense to include the norms from that law into this draft law, because there will be a definition already. Now, about compact inhabitation areas, we have raised this issue, but we haven't had a census since 2001, and we cannot take any criteria, and so that later we are not blamed about too high criteria, for example. What is the percentage, for example, the percentage of habitation by national minorities? In Poland, there is in the law that this number is 20%. Maybe it should be made in Ukraine 20%. Someone will say it is too much, others will say it's too little. If there was a census, we would have the average criterion at least, but at this point of time we don't have a criterion, so we are not including this in the law, so that this does not become a limitation in the future. As for autonomy, this issue was discussed, and again, at the very beginning I mentioned that we need to have 226 MPs of Ukraine in the session hall. Of course, we may be looking at different definitions, but our MPs are hesitant when they see the wording of autonomy there. And again, with this definition of autonomy, we will try to protect these laws through various instruments. As for this president, the president will decide by himself. Nobody will restrict him on establishing this council, but the decision will be his. So we were looking at having the basic essential law. We have a specific authority, and this is going to be the consultation and advisory body that should be dealing continuously with national minorities. As for the passport and the Civil Act register, again, this is according to the international law. There is such notion as discrimination. We are raising this issue. We are trying to have the census in Ukraine in near future, and during this census, people, if they wish, for example, they might indicate that they belong to this or another national minority. At least this is supported. As for civilian acts records, we are communicated with State Migration Office, and all international representatives say that this may be perceived as discrimination, such records, such entry, as discrimination. As for the forum, we support 100%. And we have a discussion whether this should be described at the level of the law. When I met with you, I suggested to you that you might propose a date that this would become the all-Ukrainian day of celebration, like Day of Nationalities of Ukraine, or the Day of Unity of National Communities, any term. I would like to hear this from you, and we might even include a clause in the law that it should be an annual celebration. So you might suggest both the wording and the date. Thank you. The next floor, I'm giving the floor to Mikhailo Mikhailovich and Joe, Democratic Union of Hungarians of Ukraine.
Доброго дня. Чути мене?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me well? Yes, we do. I'll take 1 minute of your time, and then I would request to you to give the floor to the head of our association, Mr. Zubanich. Let me respond quickly to two comments that you have made as to indigenous people. I'm reading the comments of the opinion of the Venice Commission to the law on the state language, where it is clearly stated that kin state shouldn't be a criterion for that. As to the nationality, you're right, it's not recommended, but when it comes to vital records, the parents have the right to record their nationality, not the nationality of a child, because the child can change that when an adult, and there are no legal obstacles in regard with regard to that. So the floor is given then to Mr. Zubanich, head of the Civil Society Association, Democratic Union of Hungarians in Ukraine. Could you please unmute your mic? When we had a meeting in Uzhgorod, we passed this over to you, and let me tell you that we sent these proposals to the Secretariat using the email that you referred to. That's the proposals of the Hungarians of Transcarpathians of our association. And we had other national organizations that joined us in with that. And I think you'll get this proposal of 11 pages. When we analyzed the law in detail, we were guided by the Constitution, Declaration of the Rights of National Minorities, effective legislation on national minorities of Ukraine, and Council of Europe Convention on the Protection of the Rights of National Minorities, and European Charter. The document, therefore, that we emailed to you contains several major comments, and I think the committee should take them into consideration when finalizing the text of the draft law. Most of the issues there deal with the implementation of the international obligations of Ukraine, including the Framework Convention and the European Charter. The thing is that European integration of Ukraine, as it is stated in the Constitution of Ukraine, as the main direction of the country, require the state to fully incorporate all the provisions of the European acts. And these two documents will be subject to close scrutiny by the Council of Europe. So my request to you is to pay more attention to that and adjust the text of the draft law, given the proposals and opinions and these two major documents that the Parliament approved of too. The right to education in mother tongue and the use of the mother tongue. So we have proposals to this, and we believe that the draft law doesn't have the right to study and to education in the mother tongue, and it is contrary to the constitutional guarantee. The right to use mother tongue is another constitutional provision, and this provision is not reflected in the draft law in question either. So we therefore came up with the detailed proposals. You'll see them in the text that we received. We suggest that you should include our ideas. That's 5 pages. A significant other comment when it comes to the text of the draft law, that's the right to preserve the traditional place of residence of national minorities. And there is a discrepancy between the draft law and the international law and effective legislation, namely the law on national minorities, and the draft law does not contain any guarantees of the state as represented by respective authorities to decide what is reasonable and proportionate. And we believe that we should eliminate the conflicting norms between the national legislation and international norms in this regard. We also have comments as to the right to effective participation of representatives of national minorities in the life of the country. The proposals believe that well, special conditions for effective participation are not provided for by the law. So therefore, there are several ideas in that regard. Violation when it comes to exercising the right of the national minority to education in mother tongue and the use of the mother tongue. There is a lack of any provisions that govern the toponyms in mother tongue. Some international commitments are not taken into consideration, and they are mandatory to make sure that Ukraine joins European community, lack of regulation of some effective rights, including the right to participate in political life, both at the local level and at the level of the state, the national level. So the minority therefore does not have a clearly established rights that it can resort to make a say as to the life of the minority and the state at different levels. The law should be done in a much broader scope, 20, 30 pages, to include detailed provisions that would cover all the recommendations made by international organizations. There are several contradictions when it comes to the laws, to include, for instance, publications. Some provisions claim that the government should promote printed products or printed publications by national minorities, but paragraph 5 of Article 11 says that publications that are not funded from public budget or local authorities are not entitled to publish using 50 by 50 funding, and well, it should be, well, they are mandated to publish 50% of their publications in Ukrainian language. In Transcaucasian region, we didn't have many publications. Most of the money that we use for that were grants. We have a comparative table with all our comments. Thank you, Laszlo. You spoke more than 6 minutes. We added some time not to interrupt you. Quick comments to what was said. You provided comments to the old version. I don't know who provided the text to you, which civil society organization. Please double check the text that is available on our website. It's very different from what you have been commenting. That's the first thing. Then what Mikhailo said, as to the opinion of the Venice Commission and indigenous people, Venice Commission recommends that we are guided by the international law. And at the moment, all the countries that incorporated the term indigenous people into national legislation were governed by one fundamental criterion, whether there is a kin state or there is none. At the moment, we don't have a single state that would adopt the law on indigenous people and would include representatives of the nationalities that have this state. So it wasn't our invention, it was it is the principle of international law, and we just abide by that. As to the places of residence and the possibility to leave them, toponyms, sorry, that's the law on this Ukrainian as the state language and the resolution. You were saying that we have to clearly incorporate all international recommendations made to Ukraine. That would mean that we need to copy all resolutions and make it into a separate law. If the resolution has been ratified, then automatically it becomes part of the national legislation. We don't need to copy that. As soon as we do that, then the main expert department of the Parliament of Ukraine would point it out as a deficiency of this draft law, because they don't welcome any type of overlapping and copying identical or similar provisions or resolutions. As to election, we were guided by the idea that all national minorities have an opportunity to select and elect their representatives to participate at different representative authorities, whether at local level or national level. A separate scene that you raised is how to phrase that. When we talked to you, that just for everybody to know, you used Hungary as an example. Indeed, Hungary has that, but Hungary identifies 11 national minorities. If you take into account that in some regions of Ukraine, we have 100 or 130 representatives of national minorities. In Odessa, we were told that it is 165. So if you take 450 members of the parliament in Ukraine, you can't have 168 out of 450 as national minorities. I represent the Azov region. Kisa represents Bulgarians, Hinsburska represents Jews. We are single seat representatives. So make sure that representatives of the national minorities run for the parliament and make sure that they are voted for, they are elected. So we are not going to draw a line between just general procedures of election. Under international law, that's going to be seen, if you do that, as discrimination with respect to national minorities or representatives of other nationalities. So, Maria Sivka, Federation of Polish Associations in Ukraine. So something is wrong with the sound. We can't hear you. You have some issues with the sound. I'm telling this to Olena.
Вімкніть, будь ласка, мікрофон пані Марії Миколаївні.
Can you turn Maria's mic on? So there is some problem with the microphone of Olena. While Maria is trying to fix this issue, let's move on. Let me give the floor to Sergei Petkov, Doctor of Law, Professor, Vice President of Ukrainian Bulgarian Association.
Доброго дня.
Good afternoon, dear representatives of ethnic communities of Ukraine. Good afternoon, representatives of authorities. Can you hear me well? Yes, we can.
Дякую. Тоді я продовжую.
Okay, then I'll continue. Indeed, I share the opinion of the speakers who said that the draft law we are discussing today, and just trying to stick to the point, this law is not just necessary, that's timely, pertinent, and it's long overdue. We do need it. At the same time, we need to focus on the following scenes that should be part of the law, and that's a requirement of international organizations, including the Venice Commission. It should include clear definitions that should be used in this law and other legal acts to have uniformity in this regard and uniform understanding. In particular, we need to give the definition to ethnicity, to this concept, so that it is used further in other acts to show that ethnos includes national community, national minority, indigenous people, etc. And then it would be easier to use other laws and draft other laws. At the same time, I would like to underscore that the main scientific expert department are normally not taken into account into the parliament, by the parliament. So we shouldn't refer to this department, because if parliament ignores that, then we should be governed by the international case law and practice. With respect to census, we haven't had it for a while. We never know when it's going to be held, but we have vital records, and there we have all the records with respect to citizens of Ukraine. And it's not really difficult to make sure that when the child is born, this entry is made, and it doesn't violate any human rights. On the other hand, it expands the rights. So there is a line there, and if parents wish so, they can add nationality into the records. The Parliament Commissioner for Human Rights, Denisova, said that unfortunately representatives of national communities are not aware of their rights and don't know how to use them, and the government doesn't state mechanisms that would protect national minorities from lawlessness, racism, and arbitrariness. So I suggest, therefore, that legislation should clearly define the violations that are committed with respect to national minorities, representatives of the national minorities or communities rather, and how this is prosecuted. At the same time, the Constitution doesn't have a set of terms that are used in our legislation. For instance, criminal offense is missing in the Constitution. Criminal misdemeanor is missing there. They have offense, administrative offense, and disciplinary offense. But At the same time, the lawmaker uses the terms that are missing in the Constitution and brings people to account for committing these offenses. I wish all of us interesting and useful work. All the suggestions and proposals seem to be taken into consideration, and we'll keep submitting our ideas, and lawmakers will amend effective legislation respectively. Thank you. 2.5 minutes, so we are going to interrupt you on minute 3.
Не просто використовують, а навіть, по-перше, заборонено законодавством, якщо немає висновку ГНЕУ, розглядати на засіданні комітету. Це перше. Наступне, якщо є негативний висновок ГНЕУ, то на це народні депутати...
If there is a negative summary, then MPs should be pay attention to this. At least all executive authorities also make a provision about this GNEU conclusion that is negative. I can mention top 5 draft laws that were adopted having the GNEU's negative conclusion. But all 5 were adopted in turbo regime mode and then were amended. So we have to take into account the GNEU conclusions. As for the Constitution and definitions, not all legal definitions are included in the Constitution, you are right. But in our case, the problem is that there is a specific definition in the Constitution. If it were not there, then nobody would be against to have this definition included or initiate a new legal notion of national community, whatever. But the problem is that we have this definition of national minority included in the Constitution as well as international agreements, included resolutions that have been ratified in Ukraine. There we can not go outside this terminology. As for the civilian acts authorities, they only fix the birth. But later on, those people may travel across Ukraine or outside Ukraine. This is about now the migration service. And we tried to find a mechanism for having all this information entered into the documents, but our international partners also say that this is maybe a discrimination. So we are looking for ways to have not a law, but resolution, explanation that would allow the state migration service to specify this information so that in the future, such person who want to self-identify themselves, they're belonging to national minorities, might have this shown legally. Next is now Maria Mikolayevna, as I have been told, the Federation of Polish communities in Ukraine. She was having previously a technical problem with the microphone. No, it hasn't been solved. And also, can you make it louder, the sound? No, Maria Mikolayevna, maybe representatives of your organization that might join us so we could hear the position of the Federation of Polish Unions in Ukraine. There is some technical problem, we cannot hear you. Now, let's go on. I give the floor to Ms. Bursko Aurica, NGO, Interregional Association, Romanian Community of Ukraine. Thank you for giving me the floor. Good afternoon, all participants. As we mentioned, the meeting in Chernivtsi and even with the absence of the draft law, we commented that there is a number of approaches that have been in place in recent years. So that beginning even from adoption of the law on education, narrowing the rights of national minorities, including in the sphere of education, we made a provisos that in this draft law on national minorities, that is essential for our life. We would want to see, and we mentioned this in Chernivtsi, the Dmitro Valeryevich, we mentioned that without having all clauses of Declaration on the Rights of Nationalities adopted in 1991 and the motivation for national minorities to take part in the referendum in 1991 on the 1st December, and in the clauses of Constitution and the Articles 8, 10, 22, 119, 132 of the Constitution. This draft law should provide a basis for having guarantees from the state in for national minorities, but this draft law gives a grounds for the narrowing of existing freedoms and rights, and cannot be supported by the Human Rights Committee, including the right, having the right for national minorities to receive instruction in the mother tongue. All clauses should include the norms of direct action that are included in the Constitution, Article 8 of the Constitution. It should correspond to this draft law to international commitments that have been ratified by the Parliament of Ukraine. Article 9 of Constitution is a part of national legislation. And also, if, for example, the draft law clauses or provisions are contrary to international law, then international law will prevail. Again, this draft law, its provisions should correspond to the provisions that are included in the Constitution. And also, we support the analysis of the draft law that was made by our colleagues, Hungarians of Ukraine. And we have always tried to have a constructive approach and to be heard, not only to be listened to, but also that our constructive proposals are taken into account. But this does not happen here. The Committee for National Minorities should generalize our proposals in the draft law. But we are not losing hope that these proposals might take a place in this draft law before it is forwarded to the Parliament. You are going to improve it. Maybe there is going to be a legislative initiative to the Parliament of Ukraine. We do ask you to do this.
Я коротко прокоментую з приводу.
Thank you, Ms. Aurica. 4 minutes. I will comment on it. With regard to education, what were we based on? We were based on that the law on education was recognized by decision of Supreme Court. It was recognized constitutional, and this law includes all norms with regard to education. In the Constitution, we have Article 53. It states that citizens belonging to national minorities have the right to be taught in their mother tongue or have the right to be to receive instruction in their the tongue. This is the decision of the Supreme Court. We have it, and we won't be able to do anything with it. While supporting many of your ideas, I would like to mention that at the level of the committee, at the level of the parliament, we will be seeking consensus. We need to have the MPs voting for this as constitutional majority. If we include all of your comments, then this law won't be adopted. We should seek a consensus. And me, as the chair of subject matter committee, I am trying to find consensus between national minorities, different factions in the parliament. I communicate with MPs how ready they are to vote for this or that provision. Of course, I have a perception of the majority of proposals, but this doesn't mean that it will be accepted by the parliament. With all respect, we cannot respect that all 100% comments will be included in the draft law. So my colleagues also comment on the proposals that we are going outside the draft law. We won't have all votes for the draft law. Next floor is given to Maltsev Oleksiy, Melitopol Organization of Greeks. Good afternoon. Can you hear me well? Good afternoon. Greetings to all. We will probably we will provide all our proposals in writing. I would like you to pay attention to Article 8. We believe that this is the most important instance. For example, that supports the link between the law and the person. This Article 8 says that each person individually decides. They cannot individually decide whether they are Greek or Bulgarian. We believe that a person may only have the right, and if he or she agrees, this fact of belonging to a national minority may be disclosed, made public. But if we say that mother is Bulgarian and the father is a Tatar, but I may decide that I am Greek, this is how it is written in the draft law. Therefore, we believe that there should be a document, there should be an register of civilian act, for example, where it will be specified who the parents are, Tatars or Bulgarian, and this information should be maintained. For example, does any of you know how much I earn? No, but the tax inspectorate, they have and maintain this information and might make it public under specific circumstances. Therefore, I would suggest that this information, who is the mother of this child or who is the father of the child, should be maintained in some documents. It shouldn't be specified in the passports to be not discriminated. And then each person will have the right to disclose or not disclose this information. So we should be able to identify it. There is statistics mentioned in Article 18 of this draft law, census, for example. This issue will address many. This article will address many issues and how the law would apply to our citizens. Then one more thing, I haven't read it to the end, but I haven't seen for non-citizens of Ukraine any provisions. For example, I asked it in Melitopol, if we have a representative of national minority, a student from Morocco, they are not citizens of Ukraine, but this is still an issue. Thank you. Thank you, Oleksiy. I would comment on this. This wording was agreed upon based on Article 3 of the Framework Convention on the Protection of National Minorities. So we cannot go outside of it. because this convention has been ratified in Ukraine, self-identification of the persons belonging to national minority. Now about non-citizen of Ukraine, according to the international law, sustainable practice, this is a special law for Ukrainian citizens. We are all Ukrainian citizens. If the state guarantees additional special rights for us, it automatically applies to citizens of Ukraine. If it is other countries' national, this or person without citizenship, this law would not apply to them. This is according to the international law and the vision of similar laws outside Ukraine. Thank you. I give the floor to Ovakim Harayinovich, Executive Director of NGO, the Union of Armenians of Ukraine. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes. Firstly, I wanted to say thank you for having this very up-to-date platform to communicate not only with the center, with government institutions and authorities that work with national cultural associations, but to communicate with the colleagues as well. First of all, I'm thinking that you have enough qualified staff addressing internal issues. So I would like to ask our colleagues to give consultations on their peoples, their communities. I want to speak with regard to Armenians about our organization, so that we all understand the historic facts that exist and that will exist. For example, with regard to indigenous people, we have been living here since 15th century. We have over 28 churches included in the Crimea, over 60 hajkars. And I think many national communities and indigenous people, and hopefully maybe Ukraine will recognize those peoples who have lived there for a long time and have historic heritage to be recognized, acknowledged as indigenous people. I might give example of Armenian cathedral in Lviv, ancient one that we have there. And wanted to mention the draft law. There are provisions in this regard, but I wanted to highlight that in the even in public media, there are positive moods about national minorities. I wanted to highlight that national minorities should be able to broadcast in their mother tongue, in their own language, so that what is written in the documents becomes a practice, and we should have, at least in Kyiv, broadcasting from different people in their own languages. That would be a great step, and this would show that Ukraine is working in this area and acknowledges many historic and indigenous people inhabiting different areas of Ukraine. Secondly, there are Sunday schools. We have them. There are schools where our children can be taught in their language, learn their language, but there are very few of these at the national level, and we would like this issue to be addressed as well. Thank you. Now, again, we have the rules of procedure, 3 minutes for presentations, and we are happy to hear proposals with regard to draft law. Next, floor is given to Tatiana Horunja, Congress of National Communities of Ukraine.
Пані Тетяна, ви нас чуєте?
Tatiana, can you hear us?
Будь ласка.
Так. Ви мене чуєте?
Так, так, чуємо.
Чудово. Дякую за зустріч. І я
У вас що з інтернетом? Ми вас не
You
чуємо.
have unstable internet connection. We can't hear you.
Пані Тетяно, спробуйте, будь ласка, відключити відео. Ось тоді вас
Try to turn your camera off and then we'll hear you better.
Давайте поки чекаємо.
While we are waiting for Tatiana to fix that, let me give the floor to Maria Sivko, Association of Polish Organizations. Can you hear me?
Доброго дня.
Federation of Polish Organizations in Ukraine has around 110 organizations and is a national association. We discussed the draft law on national minorities. We support the new draft law on national minorities in Ukraine, and we would suggest the following. In July 2000, the President Kuchma set up the Council of Representatives of Civil Society Organizations of National Minorities of Ukraine that acts in the capacity of advisory authority at the President of Ukraine. In May 2006, by the executive order of President Yushchenko, it was changed into the Council of Ethnic Issues, and it was liquidated in 2010. Therefore, we suggest that the new law on national minorities should have a section on the Council on the issues of national and ethnic minorities that would contribute to the unity in the society, harmonization of international relations, and development of ethnic language and cultural identity of national minorities of Ukraine. Did you hear me?
добре, дякую.
Yes, we did. It is appropriate to have in the new law on the national minorities fundamental provisions on education, culture, and social integration of minorities, and the obligations of authorities to undertake respective measures, including financial support to cultural institutions, art groups of national minorities, organization of cultural events, and invest to preserve national identity of minorities, support radio and TV of minorities, and protect historical sites of national minorities. Educational information awareness work includes library and education of children. The Federation repeatedly requested the different authorities of Ukraine to allow for the schools with Polish language of tuition to have the status of Polish schools. Therefore, Article 2, where the right to education is established, to change in the following: to allow for the schools with the Polish language of tuition acquire the status of the schools of Polish national minority. Thank you.
Дивіться, пані Марія, з чого ми виходили? Ми створюємо дорадчу консультаційну
Setting up an advisory consultative authority on the issues of national minority. We didn't give it a name. Somebody wants it to be called a council. Somebody wants it to be called differently, just as separate authority. We thought that you would set up a designated authority, and it is up to you to decide how you would call it at the meeting of the national minority representatives. at a specially designated authority. You would be able to give it a name, to decide how often you are going to meet, whether there's going to be every day or on a quarterly basis. As members of the parliament, we didn't limit you in any way in this regard. So under this approach that we are pursuing, you can set up any body, develop the capacity or the mandate competences of this body that you would draft based on your consensus and approval. As to Polish schools, again, given the large number of nationalities, we can't have something for somebody in this law. I don't have this for others. We are developing the overall general conditions for all national minority representatives. You want to have Polish schools established by the law. So given this approach that you offer, then we need to include 178, let's say, schools, because as soon as we do this for you, then we'll get the question from the others, why didn't you do the same for us? That's why this law doesn't have anything specific for Polish schools or the schools with the Polish language as the language of tuition. We have lots of schools where tuition is done in the language of national minorities, so there should be the same conditions for everybody. Kondor Volodymyr, head of the Roma Civil Society Organization Strategy 2020. Good afternoon, dear Chair, dear participants. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the chance to speak on behalf of the coalition of non-governmental organizations of Roma organizations in Ukraine. I would like to welcome this draft law and say that we support the draft law the way it is. We will provide some comments by June 7, but anyways, the law should meet the needs and requirements of modernity for national minorities, and that's what it is to do. And we would like to thank the committee and you, the head of the committee personally, for the consultations that you organized in the regions. It was really inspiring for us. That means that we are on the same path to protect the rights of national minorities, and that's great. A brief comment as to nationality as a line in the passport. Unfortunately, for Roma community, I can say that it was really painful experience when we had nationality indicated in the passport, and that led to the discrimination of Roma community. And we are against this line in our passports. We don't want it to be there. Given today's discussion, let me speak about Roma community. At the regional meetings, I expressed my concern as to Roma strategy that was to be approved by the Cabinet of Ministers. Unfortunately, I was told that the Cabinet of Ministers is blocking this program at the moment, and there are different suggestions. Maybe other options are better, but we lost touch with the the ministry, and we don't receive any official information as to what's currently happening to this strategy. And I would appreciate if you could sort of stay posted on this as well, because we are really concerned. When it comes to general comment, I would say that we support this draft law and ready to cooperate with you on this further. Thank you. At the end of the meeting, I'll give a chance to speak to the representatives of the ministry and the state service on ethnic policy. Maybe Olena will comment your question. The next is Tetiana Horunja, Congress of National Communities of Ukraine. You had technical issues. Can you talk now? She's not here, right? Okay. Konstantin Shurov, head of the Russian community of Ukraine. Not here. Ines Kadyrova, are you here? Good afternoon, dear participants of this call. I am speaking from the Council of Associations of Minorities of Ukraine. Let me thank the Committee for decisive steps to develop interethnic relations in Ukraine. The law on national minorities in Ukraine is a very important law at this time, particularly since we need reasonable, well-thought steps to be made at this stage. We heard very good comments made today that potentially would complement this law, but let me underscore that that's a very democratic document that meets international standards. The law on the national minorities should be adopted now. Maybe at a later stage, we will have to improve the document. That's the way that is kind of understandable, because with the time, we need to resort to some improvement. The Council of National Communities of Ukraine that we represent encourages close dialogue between minorities and authorities, and forum would contribute to that. There we would be able to discuss really pertinent issues. Ministry of Culture made several attempts to do that. Previously, for 3 years, we had the Festival of National Cultures, but the council wants to broaden that and encompass larger variety of communities. So I think we are about to adopt this law. We are ready to make it happen and cooperate on that. And thank you for engaging in the discussion of these very important issues. Thank you. Thank you. As to National Forum of National Cultures, the proposal you made. Okay, again, I keep saying this. Could you come up with the date? I don't want members of the parliament fix the date because it could be the date that you're not happy with. Now, please come up with your ideas, and we are open to that. And it could be just a resolution or something that would approve that. The National Forum of National Cultures, any name, any date. Then I have a draft of the concept with respect to forum. Can I email this to you and we can have a separate meeting to discuss that? Sure. Thank you. Borto Josip, Deputy Head of the Association of Hungarian Culture, Transcarpathians. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll be very specific and short. Under Article 22 of the Constitution of Ukraine, when adopting new laws or amending effective legislation, it's not allowed to narrow the existing rights and freedoms. The law adopted in 1992, the law on national minorities, is an effective law. Article 6 of this law, the government guarantees to all national minorities the right to cultural autonomy, use and tuition in mother tongue, etc. You can follow the text of the law. Paragraph 1, Article 13 of the draft law says that citizens belonging to national minorities have the right to study the language of the national minorities respective educational institutions or institutions of the associations. For some reason, you forgot the wording of the previous law, the law that is effective, and you say that have the right to study in the mother tongue. So my request is to change the text of Article 1, Paragraph 1, and the citizens have the right to study in the mother tongue, because the law shouldn't limit or narrow the rights and provisions of the Constitution. That's the first thing. Second, the previous text of the draft law had a provision, that's Article 13. The government promotes in establishing preschool and after-school institutions to study language, culture of national minorities or in the language of national minorities. At the moment, it is missing in this text. I would request to keep it. Thirdly, the Association of the Hungarians of Transcarpathia submitted other proposals with the Association of Hungarians that emailed the text to you. Thank you. As to being able to study in the language or to study the language, we in this law refer to the law on education that was found constitutional. In the latter, it was clearly stated whether it is studying the language or education in the language. I took a note of that. We discussed this question in Uzhhorod, that's about constitutional provisions, and I quoted Article 53 of the Constitution of Ukraine, where it is clearly stated learning or education in the language of national minorities. So there is no any conflict here. We do not narrow the rights of national minorities in the draft law here. Thank you. Let me give the floor to Lucia Sachina, head of the Board of Roma Organizations, Zhytomyr region. Lucia,
Ми вас бачимо, але не чуємо. Да, будь ласка.
Дмитрий Валерьевич, все коллеги, добрый день. Я вас рада до всех.
good afternoon, dear colleagues. I'm very happy to see all of you.
Я благодарна
I'm really grateful to those who drafted this law. I know what it is. I draft laws and programs myself. I know how difficult it is. I want this draft law, though, to contain some other scenes, to provide identification and coverage by social services of the representatives of national minorities, in particular kids or children that need assistance in dire straits, and provide social protection and support to them. Second, to provide for the training of teachers of different national minority languages, set up the University of National Minorities. That was the third. Fourth, to provide with social housing as per effective legislation of representatives of national minorities. Fifth, to provide housing, including social housing at the expense of construction and buying at the secondary housing market and providing loans for the construction of apartments. And we need to promote to promote the mechanism that would be used to lease offices for the organizations to meet the needs, ethnic needs, or the organizations and groups that belong to ethnic minorities, and also to create memorials and museums of the representatives of national minorities, to publish newspapers of national minorities with financial support provided by the government. And I would like to take this opportunity and say that well, there is a request. The draft strategy for the development of national minority until the period of 2030, and we discussed this with the Ministry of Culture. We don't really need the draft. Well, we used to have something like that, and it didn't help us a lot. We need specific programs. As to funding, you know, we need to think it through.
Дякую, пані Люсія. Коротко коментар. По все, що
Thank
ви
you. Lucia, a brief comment. What you mentioned, museums, monuments, support of printed media, whether you want it or not, it's general European principle of distributed funding. Submit programs, they will be reviewed, and then allocations will be made. This was not discovered in invented in Ukraine. It's everywhere in Europe, and we are going to also work like this because in the constitution it states we are moving towards the EU. As for the education, yes, the state, it's already mentioned in the laws, in the legislation, that the state will prepare and provide professionals for giving the instruction in their own languages. Then also with regard to premises, I have so many papers here to be ready to comment. Article 9, and new paragraph 3, the NGOs and national minorities, the not-profit organizations included in the register have the right to rent state, government or communal property according to the law. Therefore, this issue is addressed by this draft law. Thank you. I'm giving the floor to Mr. Siladila Lajošatović, trans-Carpathian Hungarian Linguistic Pedagogical Union. Thank you all. Thank you for giving me the floor. I will try to be specific with my proposals. We've heard that the Constitutional Court acknowledged the constitutionality of the law. I have a proposal that this committee, or maybe MP, maybe there may be submission to the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine in the law of Ukraine on the full secondary education or functioning of the state language. This law narrows even the rights that have been written. It states here that gives the right on receiving instruction in their own language for national minorities, but another law on education states that there can be only 40% of instruction in their own language. Also, there is the issue of assimilation or integration. For example, narrowing of educational institutions, establishments, and to be able to receive instruction in own language is a step towards assimilation. Next thing, you mentioned the Venice Commission. There is paragraph 110, they wrote, the absence of the motherland state. For example, they write about it corresponds to how this corresponds to the settlement of this provision. So when we are talking about indigenous people, for example, this commission is a respectful organization, and in its conclusion summary, it says about non-corresponding to the principle, and also Article 116 of United Nations, the UN. And about indigenous people, they also have this description. With regard to the country that they inhabit. And irrespective of their legal status, indigenous people maintain all their political, cultural institutions. There is international practice that is contrary to the provisions about national minorities and indigenous people, how they are distinguished here. We would like you to take account of this issue. If you are stating that only 60–80% of instruction is received not in own language, this again is not quite corresponding to this education in the own language provision. And again, I commented the law on education. It was recognized as constitutional. There was submission of MPs. As for the law on functioning of the state, Ukrainian language as a state, there was submission of 51 MPs to the Constitutional Court. There was a panel of judges. The constitutional proceeding has been opened, and the great chamber of the court is reviewing this issue. So the MPs have already made this submission. Next, what you commented on indigenous people. Venice Commission gives recommendations. But again, when I was explaining, I mentioned that all countries that were addressing this issue in the law, the principle was whether the nationality has a motherland state or has no such motherland state. And Ukraine has undertaken the same principle. This was not invented by us. This is used in other European countries. Therefore, we have undertaken the same principle. That's all. Thank you. I'm giving the floor to Ms. Зайцева Великодна Світлана, Одеса, branch
Адама Міцкевича. Пані Світлана.
of Adam Mickiewicz, Ms. Svetlana. Yes, this is the Union of Polish people in Ukraine. Thank you very much for this meeting, for a lot of work drafting this law. Be read it careful. The weakest links here are about the language and education. We will also have our proposals to the committee to have these corrected. But also there is Article 14, maintaining the cultural identity of national minorities. There is paragraph 3 here about the monuments of history, culture, and religion of культури, national minorities inhabiting areas in Ukraine are part of national culture. We want this list to be added with the sites of historic memory, like battle sites, so that these historic memorial sites also come under protection of the state. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Svetlana, for this very brief, very specific proposal. By the way, this issue that you raised during our discussion in Odessa about the diggings, yesterday the committee at its meeting voted for a specific decision, and you can address the Ministry of Culture to have them help you in this as soon as possible. Next, Mr. Grigorenko Petro Dmitrovich, President of All Ukrainian Units of NGO organizations, Congress of Romas of Ukraine.
Ми вас бачимо, але не чуємо.
We can see you, but we cannot hear you. Can you hear me now? Yes, we can. Good afternoon, all. Thank you very much for this opportunity to take part in such, you may call it a historic meeting, because drafting of this law has a rather long time duration. Mr. Toft and other people can working in the area of protection of national minority and representing the issue. This has been already the third decade when this issue has been dealt with, worked on, and we can have hopes that today's work will promote the birth of this law in good quality. I join the thoughts that have been expressed by our representatives of national communities in Ukraine. And I would like to mention one thing, maybe a few things. Number one is that in this law will remain on paper in its major part unless it has it includes an item about the establishment of appropriate components of national minorities that would represent the national communities in the governance bodies. This would be the structural components that would deal with this issue at the level of, in regions, at the level of cities, towns, communities, territorial hromadas, that would directly deal with those issues. Since we have had messages that those issues that have been raised by representatives of national minorities in oblasts, in rayons, are sometimes not perceived by the local deputies of oblast or other level authorities. And these issues may then not be solved. This is a very important instance, and this should be detailed more in the law. But most important, not just organizationally, but it should be stated that such bodies should be mandatorily established in oblasts. They had existed before the National Committee for Religious was there. Thank you. Mr. Petro, with regard to local self-government authorities and compulsory establishment of advisory bodies, there is Article 20 in the law, which states that such bodies, authorities may be established. In the transitional provisions, we are making amendments to the law of Ukraine on local self-government of Ukraine. But again, to make this clause mandatory. Our vision is there is a decentralization reform which shifts the powers to local authorities. And those local self-government authorities that are formed via the election, they should decide whether or not they will establish such authorities. For example, when we were in Odessa, they informed us that they have such authority as the Association for Organization of National Minorities. So locally, they will decide whether or not they will need such authorities. In Hungary, for example, we met an individual who having the status of advisor for Roma-related issues. Therefore, we won't be able to describe this all in the law. And we do not need to do this. We have general things that we determine in the law, but this opportunity is, this modality is clearly described at the level of the law. The next is Makropoulou, Deputy Chair of Greek Communities. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, we can hear you. We can hear you. 3 minutes, Valentin, let me remind you. Yes, I will be brief. Article 4 of the draft law.
Держава гарантує всім громадянам України.
State guarantees to all citizens of Ukraine to maintain and develop ethnic and cultural identity, and also we should add that their identity is guaranteed, then it will be linked with all other articles of the law. Then Section 4, Article 4, advisory bodies to address the issues and so on. Under the local self-government authorities, the advisory bodies may be formed. They should not, the wording should not be may be formed, but are or shall be established. This will be different because they must deal with the problems of national minorities. Therefore, I would suggest to have this corrected. And then final and transitional provisions, the same, to exercise their powers, the village, municipal, rayon and oblast councils may. It should not be may. They shall establish. It's not that they may establish, they shall, they must establish. I believe this will be correct. And the last thing, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine has its own printed media, newspaper, Holos of Ukraine, Voice of Ukraine. A few years ago, there was a good tradition that national minority newspapers were also published alongside with this newspaper, and they had all Ukrainian status. We request you to bring it back so that indigenous people, for example, have this Holos of Ukraine, the Voice of Ukraine, published again, and have national minorities newspaper published there. Again, as I have already mentioned, for example, local self-government authorities have this opportunity to establish such bodies. we may not commit them as for the financing. The principle is that the project programs are submitted, and then this body will decide where to allocate the funds. I was trying to give the floor to Shurov Konstantin. He's the Russian community of Ukraine. He's the head of it. If you're here.
Пан Шуров, я надаю вам
Mr.
можливість.
Shurov, you have the floor.
У вас піднята рука, і ви пишете.
You have your hand raised.
Правильно подивіться, як пишеться моє прізвище. Так.
I'll check proper spelling of my name.
Коваленко Шнайдер Людмила Федорівна.
Kovalenko Schneider, chair of the German Culture Center, member of the Presidium of Germans in Ukraine. Can you hear me?
Пан Шуров, ви будете тоді
Yes.
вже наступний.
Mr. Shurov, can you speak after the lady? Sorry. Okay. Good afternoon, dear colleagues, representatives of national minorities and public authorities. Thank you very much for the invitation for this representative meeting and an opportunity to speak. I share the opinion of my colleagues of the Council on National Minorities, who said that well, we heard a lot about Article 11, that's the use of the language of national minorities and the right to education of the national minorities. We want to have all provisions and articles of the Constitution to be incorporated into this law to guarantee rights and freedoms. At the Ministry of Education, we keep discussing the law on education about the functioning of the state language, and we heard a lot of critical comments. I hope that the Council will provide its suggestions to the committee with respect to this draft law, and will come up with the proposals they want to be incorporated into the text of the draft law. We have always had critical comments when we had discussions, language issue, and we underscore that shouldn't be the source of ethnic tension in Ukraine. And the law on Ukrainian as the state language is to maintain the balance of protecting the state language and languages of national minorities. There is a very good opportunity now when discussing this law to maintain this balance when it comes to language policy. That's a very good opportunity also to cover the law on secondary and comprehensive education, and I hope that by taking into consideration all these proposals, the rights of national minorities will be better protected. Thank you. Thank you, Ludmila. Konstantin Shurov, can you hear me? Yes, we can. As to the procedure, the committee had 6 months to draft the law. You spent 2 years. You were to engage in drafting the law, the representatives of the national minorities. You didn't do that. So that's the product you produced. The draft law was available on the website at 9:30 on June 2 this year. So we have 2 days to read the law that you drafted in the course of 2 years. So you actions can be described as formally these actions are correct, but in fact that's inappropriate. the draft law, if it is adopted, the rights of national minorities will be violated, and the position of national minorities will be exacerbated. That's a compilation of the law on national minorities 1982, but slightly changing. The effect of discussion of this draft law in the parliament, nothing to say about the potential adoption of this draft law will be a serious blow for the image of Ukraine at the international area, and Ukraine will be represented as the state that doesn't honor its obligations before the international community. So we are facing the challenge whether to follow the constitution and follow the letter and spirit of the constitution, or to play into the hands of some politicians and political factions. We choose the constitution because we are law-abiding citizens and we cannot violate the constitution. Therefore, we joined the document that was drafted by our colleagues, and I believe that this event could be just one first step to develop a new draft law on the national minorities in Ukraine. A few comments. Nobody gave me 6 months to produce this draft law. Those who deal with these issues know that 6 months were stated in the transitional provisions in the law on functioning of Ukrainian as the state languages. It was the time given to the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine. When we realized that the Cabinet of Ministers doesn't do anything in this regard, we, members of the parliament, set up the working group to draft this law. Nobody limited me. It was my initiative, the initiative of my colleagues. Instead of telling me that we are not doing our work properly, you could have welcomed that we actually started doing something in this regard. The next thing, we have representatives of many organizations who were present at the parliamentary hearings, at the hearings of the committee, where we repeatedly said that we are developing the new draft law on national minorities of Ukraine. Anybody who wanted to be engaged were engaged in the process. So again, when it comes to this argument, I am objecting to that. Cannot agree with what you said with respect to me personally and my committee. As to the comments you made, again, the new draft law was published in the morning of June the 2nd, not at 9:30, but we extended the deadline for the comments and proposals given that, and we didn't even register the draft law until we have the discussion with the national minority representatives. Thank you. Let me give the floor to Volodymyr Szczepaniak, the head of the Union of Polish Entrepreneurs, the president of the Fund of Economic Development, Polonia.
Пане Володимир.
Volodymyr,
Алло, чути мене? Доброго дня.
can you hear me? Yes, we can. Good afternoon, dear participants of this conference. The law that we are going to adopt, the law on national minorities, is very important. We all understand and know that Ukraine is rich not only in Ukrainians, but many national communities in Ukraine. I would suggest one thing, setting up the House of National Communities or National Minorities of Ukraine. I do understand that that's a costly thing, where to find money and how. Well, that's something that we can discuss at a separate meeting, and we can discuss this in more detail. This will allow to come to Kiev and different national minorities could do that, but that would be also a platform for different events, concerts, cultural events, etc. I know that we are restricted by coronavirus pandemic at the moment, but sooner or later that's going to end and we'll need that. And as soon as we have this house, then we could make money on that as well. And that's going to be a support to the government in a way, and the government then shouldn't use public funds to support national communities. I have some other proposals that could be interesting. One of them, for instance, is to identify the institution that would de facto unite national communities, and it would be engaged in drafting various legislative acts, because there could be a lot of different things that would crop up, and this law is just the beginning. So maybe next week, or when it is possible, I would request a meeting with you, and me and my colleague could come and discuss these proposals with you in more detail. Thank you, Volodymyr. As to the meeting, well, would be happy to, but you were quite right to point out that we have pandemic restrictions, but while you and Ashot, we can meet. I am on everyday basis talking to Ashot, and we can easily meet and discuss these things. We heard these suggestions of having a separate premises where different national minorities could present themselves and their products. So that's a very good idea. We should do something about that. As to legislative amendments and engaging you in this as the head of the committee, I'm open to any proposals, but let me just underscore, when it comes to legislative amendments, that's the consensus of the parliament that we need to get 226 votes, and we need to find them, to get them. Whatever amendments we are talking about, whether that's this law or any other, and a separate authority or institution. So as I said, well, this law actually establishes a state institution, the body that would be on a permanent basis dealing with the issues of national minorities. The Committee on National Minority Issues was mentioned several times today. The second president of our country, Kuchma, set up this committee. Then Yanukovych abrogated it. So we don't want this committee or this institution depend on the will of the president or the cabinet of ministers. We want this to be established by law. So there is this body, there is advisory authority working there too. So you can address a lot of issues using these institutions. The next to speak. Nadia Efiminic, the president of the Association of the Peoples of the Urals of Ukraine, the secretary of the Union of Indigenous People at the Ministry of Culture and Education of Ukraine. Nadia? Can you hear me? Good afternoon, everybody. Stay safe in these difficult times. Let me add a couple of other comments that I have to the draft law. It's really great that we see a constructive approach when discussing this draft law. We are discussing really pertinent and painful issues for all of us. We'll submit our proposals to this draft law, but let me just add that We had an online meeting with the representative of the committee, and we asked why aren't we a member of the working group, and your assistant said that there are too many scholars and experts there, that would be too much to have you there. That was the answer that we received from your assistant in March. As to the text of the law, the first section, Article 1, sorry, we don't get the sound properly. National minorities are defined by the Constitution of Ukraine and international legislation. We have a lot of people living in Ukraine of African origin and Middle East that want to be associated with the national minority groups. So the question about indigenous people and national minorities, you're talking about their their integration. So whose integration do you mean? Those who came to the country 30 years ago from Africa, Middle East, for instance, they believe that they are national minorities as well. Some of them are not integrated. Sorry, we don't get the sound.
Схоже на те, що пані Додієва було зв'язок.
Well, the engineer says that there was an unstable internet connection of the lady.
Практично під 3 хвилини, 2,5 з приводу того, що пані Надія підіймала питання.
As to the issues Nadia tried to raise, all citizens of Ukraine, if they want to identify themselves as representatives of national minority, can do that as per this law, but it says all citizens of Ukraine. As to engaging in the work, well, from the very beginning, the development of the draft law was made of several stages. The first one was when we sort of produced the text of the draft law, and it was the line in institutions, for instance, the Institute of Legislation that was involved in that. So that was the first stage. The second one was coordinating this with line ministries, respective organizations, and we did say that there will be a stage of consultations and coordinating our positions with the national minority representatives, and that's exactly what we are doing right now. And well, you can always submit your proposals, and if you had a meeting in March and your proposals were submitted to the committee, well, so it doesn't mean that we didn't have any consultations with national minority representatives. Thank you.
Лясковська Щур Вікторія, голова
Лясковська Щур, head of the Zhytomyr Polish Association.
Пані Вікторія, ми вас бачимо, але не
Victoria, we see you but don't hear you.
вимкніть, будь ласка, мікрофон.
Unmute your mic.
Пані та панове, я хочу запропонувати
Ladies and gentlemen,
трохи зміни до закону.
let me offer some changes to Article 14. That's about cultural identity of national minorities. In Zhytomyr, we have a really unfortunate situation.
щодо репресій 37-38 року, які ми зараз
when we have to deal with the various hindering obstacles in our relations with the Institute of Historical Memory. That's about the repressions that we are working on at the moment. So, I'm sorry, the sound doesn't come clearly. I would like to change this article, saying the article promotes and identifies the seats of historical memory and secures the respect of these sites and promoting relations with the Institute of National Memory of Ukraine. The link with that would be very important, because it's very important to have their cooperation to identify the burial places that were destroyed in the Soviet times, and even the signs of cemeteries and burials were destroyed then. Recently, we put the cross where we identify the remains of Polish Turks and Ukrainians. That was the fight against Moscow state in the 1660. So it required a lot of coordination, permits, etc., which was cumbersome. Article 13 about the culture, to add the government provides for and promotes support to artistic groups. So that includes salaries and the premises for them to have rehearsals, because it's very difficult to find proper places. As to premises, we spoke about that already. The law would allow to get premises without tenders, auctions, to lease it. As to promoting and supporting identity and distinct features of national minorities, okay, submit your proposals. I don't see any issue there. So we'll consider that. Thank you. Let's move on. Laishev Petro, head of the All Ukrainian Union of Belarusians.
Пане Петро. Наступний.
Ви мене чуєте?
Да, ми вас чуємо, пане Петро.
Да. Доброго дня.
Yes, we can hear you. Good afternoon to all participants of this meeting. This is an important meeting. I'm head of the Union of Belarus of Belarusians of Ukraine, Laishev. I have been head of this union since 2015. In Ukraine, there are over 207,000 ethnic Belarusians. There are about 18 regional organizations. This law that was drafted has been long waited for. It is true, and it's very important. We basically support it. The essentials have been taken into account there. There are issues that has been little time until 2nd of June. Before 7th June, we will review more issues, and then we will send our comments to your committee, right? Now, as for work on the whole, our unit is working on bringing together two of our peoples Ukrainian and Belarusians. And of course, there are many issues here. There is also political situation, although we do not interfere in the policy. We are working according to our charter, and we are working in regular mode. And of course, the coronavirus has affected our processes, but there is another concern here. With regard to pseudo organizations of Belarusians in Odessa, Lviv, Kiev, and they bring chaos, intrigues, and they post fakes of all kinds. We would request law enforcement to look closer into it. They pretend to be tourists visiting Ukraine, but who is funding them? They are not working. Therefore, we would request you to look into this. Then there is a Council of National Minorities. It should play an important role. The Union of Belarusians is not a member there because previously there was a representative of Cabinet of Ministers dealing with all issues. There was an elected body. Now Ashot is chairing it. But when you are talking about advisory council, we would request a meeting, for example, where we would elect a representative. I attended one of such meetings back in 2013 or 2014, but it was not a pleasant experience, you know, to be present there, considering the relationships between 2 or 3 individuals, you know. Thank you, Petro. I will comment briefly. Petro, your time is up. Therefore, I will comment shortly what you said. Yes, send you your proposals. I am even on Facebook. Dmitro Lubinets, and I post information regarding this draft law. We have specific email. We have an appropriate member of the committee dealing with these issues. As for law enforcement, you can forward your request to me, and I will refer them to law enforcement and will consult and advise them. That's why we want consulting authority, even for such cases when we have some sort of organizations that are not quite clear of how they work, what are they like organizationally, who are the members. So you should communicate with us. We will receive information from you and refer it to law enforcement so that we can respond quickly here. Thank you. I am giving the floor to Ms. Dora Kostova, President of NGO of Ukrainian Assembly of Bulgarians of Ukraine. Good afternoon to all participants of the conference. I'm very pleased that there is an opportunity for us to hear about important issues, to see familiar faces, like Roma community representative said that for about 30 years we have worked together. It's very nice to hear one another, and today's conference gives this opportunity to see the friends and all those who deal with these problematics. What I wanted to say about the issues that have been mentioned, the Bulgarian community of Ukraine is for having the nationality mentioned in civilian acts. This is our dignity, national dignity, our pride. We believe that this is necessary, considering that Bulgaria also gives benefits, grants benefits to the children, for example, with regard to receiving further education in Bulgaria. This is important, very important for us. What else I wanted to say about what specifically I'm doing? I'm a chief editor of the Bulgar-Ukrainian newspaper, our motherland. And also today there was expressed a concern about the national minority newspapers that were published. They were attachments to the Голос України newspaper. Then we were transferred to national minorities. And recently we have been under the Ministry of Culture. And this is one of the actual establishments that work for national minorities. People love these processes. Although there is an article in the law on the reform of the communal media, there is a provision that newspapers that foster the development national culture, they will be supported by the budget. Of course, the Ministry of Culture is co-founder of this newspaper, and people subscribe to it. But we have been published this newspaper, but we have no funding now. For 3 years, we have published these newspapers with very scarce resources. We are actually discriminating our readers who have subscribed to our newspaper. Thank you. Also, we have the procedure here, and we don't have too much time. We still need to listen to central executive authorities, representatives. With regard to newspapers, I mentioned that there is going to be a norm with regard to supporting programs of national minorities. So you can make a request about support of your book publications, newspapers, anything. Next. Teleoglu Vasil Grigorovich, he's chair of all Ukrainian organization, non-governmental, the Union of Gagauz of Ukraine. Good afternoon, dear friends. Good afternoon, dear friends of Baldosar. Yes, we can hear you. You are only given 3 minutes. I'm on the way, unfortunately, but on the road. I'm pleased to greet you all. With regard to Gagauz, there are a few key points. Like smaller, less numerous peoples of Ukraine, they require protection by the state. Karaims with Krimchaks, they were included in the law on indigenous peoples. As for Gagauz people, their issues were taken into account in the law on languages when they were drafting it, where the Gagauz people were considered to be indigenous people. Why, in this case, the Gagauz people's interests were not taken into account is a big question. This is one of the key questions that we would raise before representatives of the government and have a specific answer. Number two, those towns and settlements where Gagauz, inhabited by Gagauz, the areas are in Odessa and Zaporozhye Oblast, the most compact inhabitation. And the Gagauz people need to maintain their culture and language. Only in 6 Gagauz villages they learn Gagauz language as their mother tongue. But we need at least 30 teachers that could work in other settlements and teach children, teach the Gagauz language. There is University of Shevchenko Department of Psychology. And they can teach, train teachers, but for those children to get this education in mother tongue, they need to be provided to some provisions to be made for graduates of universities, for example, like housing, social support, etc. So those graduates, for example, of course, they are looking for better places, either in the capital for employment or abroad. This is the reality. Number 3, with regard to the names of towns and settlements, we would like to have in this law, for this law to envisage to resume justice with regard to those settlements where Gagauz people reside, to restore their old names. And there is a specific procedure through the executive authorities, and we need to go through communities, but it's very complicated. Now, about assimilation, of people. I've heard that about 160, 170 nationalities or ethnicities reside in Odessa Oblast. This doesn't mean that the majority of them are protected by the state. Thank you. My brief comment with regard to indigenous people. We were not the ones who drafted the law. This was submitted by the president. Maybe we will be asking this question when we discuss that draft law. As for support for the graduates from universities, for them to be able to give instruction in Gagauz language in villages. Of course, this would require a specific program. Well, you know, if we had similar program for others and established one for Gagauz people, but now any kind of program of this like this is non-existent. And communities, for example, when they want to invite teachers into their schools in villages, they develop such programs or seek ones. So that's why we implemented the decentralization reform. I am reminding you. Thank you. Next, I give the floor to Ms. Berezhna Olena Petrina, Director of NGO Institute of Legal Policy and Social Protection, named after Irina Berezhnaya. Good afternoon. I would like you to answer the question whether this draft law has been referred to Venice Commission, because such cynicism with regard to international recommendation, this is a unique one here, because since 5 December 2017 and 6 December, no recommendations of Venice Commission have been taken into account. Then you refer to Constitutional Court, who acknowledges the law of Ukraine on education to be constitutional. There is also Article 13 of this law, and in paragraph 1, we should add that the laws on the education, for example, For national minorities, like Venice Commission recommended, they should establish schools with instruction in the languages of national minorities, and also in the state-run schools, there should be classes for children of national minorities. As for private schools, like Venice Commission recommended, if the parents, for example, want their children to receive instruction in their own language, nobody may restrict them. Article 13 should have this norm. Then the use of the language of national minorities. So there was the recommendation of the Venice Commission. We will give our recommendation. Article 22, the last thing, is discriminational. It states that the Cabinet of Ministers will determine the procedure about how foreign states may finance their national minorities. For example, if Hungarian wants to support someone in the school, for example, or give a textbook to some school, then they need to be, will have to be looking what is recommended by Cabinet of Ministers. In part 2, it states that other countries may not help their national minorities. This is a clear discrimination. Therefore, I demand that this Article 22 is removed or the wording is changed. Thank you. Thank you. A remark. I did not quite understand why you first blame that everything happening now is a profanation, but while you are taking part in here in this, and you demand specific norms to be included in the draft law. This is number one. With number two, international relations. Everything is determined by the current laws of Ukraine. Everything is based on bilateral memoranda between the Cabinet of Ministers and, for example, Cabinet of Ministers of Hungary. Now, with regard to the Russian Federation, whether anybody likes it or not, but according to a resolution of Ukraine, the Russian Federation is recognized as an aggressor country. Therefore, undoubtedly, some rights will be restricted on the side of the Russian Federation. Again, Ukraine did not wish to lose part of this territory. Nobody made the Russian Federation to occupy the Crimea and through military aggression take away part of Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast. Thank you. Next one. I give the floor to Isaev Sergei Kurbanovich, head of the board of International Organization, International Union. Greetings to you. On behalf of International Organization, International Union, I would like to express support of any law of Ukraine on national minorities that will regulate the rights of national minorities and will provide for the interests of any national minorities. As representatives of Chechen people, I have a request that the law of Ukraine on national minorities describes some kind of authorities that will regulate the rights of national minorities, because in Ukraine they practically deport the representatives of peoples from the North Caucasus. There is a sanction-based list that has 39 Chechen people and some other representatives of people from Northern Caucasus. There is also 6 representatives from the leadership of Chechen diaspora. Number 2, There is Sheikh Mansour Battalion representatives there who for 7 years have been defending the territory of Ukraine. I would like to ask you to pay attention to this because we have representatives of central government here. Ms. Denisova is here. Please pay attention to this and give the answer to people and the whole of Ukraine and to the whole Chechen community about what is going on in the state. Thank you.
Якщо ви з приводу
Thank you.
потрапляння
As to
громадян України, бійців цього батальйону Мансура в санкційний
you
список,
talk about Mansour Battalion being on the list of sanctioned persons, let me tell you that yesterday at the meeting of the committee, we discussed this issue and we made a decision that we sent to the Defense and Security Council for the latter to look into that. As to the permanent authority, that's already part of the draft law. So we establish a permanent body that would deal with these issues. We have the head of the state service on ethnic policy and conscience, and she will comment on the draft law as well. Dear colleagues, we have been working for 2 hours 45 minutes. Let me give an opportunity to speak to different organizations. I try to make sure that everybody who wanted to speak had a chance to speak. So we have representatives of the same ethnic community or national community speak, but just different organizations. If we had more time, I would be happy to give the floor to everybody, but I just try to make sure that all national minorities have a chance to speak. Stefanovich, well, that's Polish association. Again, you know, another organization of national minority, Polish minority. Thank you for the invitation to discuss this important law. I'm not going to repeat what was said before me. Specific scenes, Article 17, paragraph 4, says about setting up an advisory council at the executive authority. I would suggest to set up advisory authority at the legislative branch, and this would be amendment to Article 20. You, as the head of the committee, you keep repeating that there are approved laws and we can't change that. So then we would have an opportunity to coordinate all legislative acts and sort of harmonize them. And another thing, I haven't worded it properly, but the idea is to have an opportunity for schools like Saturday, Sunday schools to be able to have classes in schools, whether that's days off or after regular classes in this school. And this should be provided to us free of charge. As to premises, I commented on that. Under the provision of this law, this is going to be available. As to the permanent advisory body at the Parliament of Ukraine, while we have the line committee, and as the head of this committee, I'm in touch with all of you, and I'm open to anybody. I don't think there is any issue there. So we received a proposal, and we still consider that. We wanted to set up advisory authority at the committee. This authority would be composed of representatives of national minorities. That was the idea we played with, but due to COVID-19 pandemic, we put it off. Alliance of the National Cultural Romanian Associations in Ukraine. Over to you. Can you hear me? Yes, we can. Thank you for the invitation. Alliance believe that the draft law is very good, and by June 7 we'll submit our proposals, and we'll be happy if you take them into consideration. We do value your work and the work of the working group. In this regard, we have a proposal. I just want to voice it out now. After administrative reform that we've had in Ukraine, a lot of villages merged into amalgamated communities. So the issue I'm talking about is typical for all Ukrainians. Financial burden for amalgamated communities includes funding musical schools, libraries, and houses of culture. And that's a huge issue because many communities cannot afford that, and they close down libraries, houses of culture, and musical schools. On the one hand, we understand that we can't come up with a proposal and say, well, the government should fund our houses of culture, musical schools, libraries, etc. So our proposal is probably Ukrainian government could go back to what we used to have, and virtually all amalgamated communities will get funding from public budget. I mean, musical schools, libraries, houses of culture will be funded from public budget. If that's possible, that would be good to have. Or if not, then probably you would recommend what can be done, because it's very important for us to preserve the musical schools there in Romania. And we have a lot of hobby groups, other groups, and that's very important, not only for our community, ethnic community, but for others as well. Thank you. As to the support provided to the houses of culture from public budget, given decentralization reform, we have already voted that all property of cultural institutions is the responsibility of respective community. Indeed, there is an issue there. Some communities keep developing and they have money to do that. Some communities cannot afford that. But anyways, the reform encourages you to look for opportunities, financial opportunities, for tax proceeds. We have a lot of examples when ineffective management is an obstacle in the way of community development. And on the contrary, we see the success stories, but that's decentralization reform. That's the very idea of the reform. Therefore, the houses of culture are going to be funded only from the local budget. Again, let me repeat myself, we allow for the support to be provided from the central budget to different minorities via the executive authority. So the last representative, as per the list that I have, and then we'll move over to the comments from different ministries and state service. Rafat Chubarov, head of Ukrainian Majlis. Majlis of Tatars. Good afternoon. Let me thank the committee, the head of the committee personally, for this open and honest discussion on the draft law on national minorities of Ukraine. It's not the only format the committee is working in. Our representatives are participating in various meetings of the committee, including the visits to the region. We did speak and heard that national minorities' rights should be governed by laws, and the rights of the national minorities and indigenous people are governed by the Constitution. That's Article 11. I'm not going to quote the article of the Constitution for lack of time, but let me just say that there we get the definitions that should be, we are attempting to govern by law: Ukrainian nation, indigenous people, and national minorities. That's Article 11. I am not interfering with the issues that were hot for the discussion, but I believe that we need more discussions to discuss that. I don't want to have one element of Ukrainian society to be opposed to other elements of Ukrainian society. At the moment, we are creating legislative mechanisms so that everybody enjoys equal rights and, listen to me, opportunities, because very often the rights that have been declared and the opportunities are two different scenes. I'm not going to talk about the kin states and other scenes. And the last thing, international law provides for general principles to be accounted for by the states and abide by them. But every state, by creating and developing its national legislation, implements the international law norms given the circumstances and specificities of historic development at this specific territory. And you know this well by the example of your kin states. Look at the legislation of European and not only European states, how they govern various issues in their legislation. I hope that this draft law, from my perspective, we need to make this step. We need to vote the draft law into the law. And if it doesn't prove itself in practice, then we'll improve it and move further. The same should be done with the draft law on the indigenous people of Ukraine. And Mr. Chair, when you have representatives of the Council of National Minorities of Ukraine visiting you, could you please invite me? I would like to discuss the opportunities, how we can influence our former ethnic departments that we have on the temporarily occupied territory of the Crimea. Maybe there we'll find, when discussing that, we'll be able to find the way how they can oppose Russian occupation in the Crimea. Thank you. Dear colleagues, now we have an opportunity for the representatives of various ministries and authorities to comment on that. Yuri Kononenko, Ministry of Education and Culture. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I'll try to be brief. Ministry of Education and Science supports the draft law developed by the working group. It would be good if it is voted into the law. Well, we lost internet connection with him, so that was the end. Yuri, can you hear me now? Yes. We've sent our proposals to the committee already. Article 13. Sorry, the sound doesn't come clearly. Paragraph 1, Article 13 starts with the statement that representatives of national minorities are guaranteed the right to study the national language. You shouldn't have that. You should say that it is governed by the legislation on education. You know that Article 53 of the Constitution guarantees to the national minorities not only learning the national language, but get education or study in it. So please quote the wording of the law on education. Unfortunately, I had to go to the other meeting and I didn't hear all the discussions, but we are not going to accept any other proposals. We believe that it should be phrased the way it is already phrased, but without paragraph 1, part 1 of it. I mean, Article 13. Thank you, Yuri. Thank you for supporting both education and study. We'll take a look the wording that you have, and we'll coordinate that with you.
Керівнику Державної служби з питань етнополітики та свободи совісті, пані Олена Богдан, будь ласка.
Miss Olena Bogdan with her comments, please. Thank you, Chair. A very important aspect in this draft law for us is the measures to support the cultural identity. Since September of 2020, our service started working, and we have had the following problems. We can do expert work, but we cannot support book publications or certain artistic measures. Of course, there is a pandemic impact, pandemic challenges, but there have been challenges with regard to pandemic to the budget. But the program of support has not been thought through since summer. Well, this authority needs to function and needs to have certain resources for it to operate. But of course, there need to be support to cultural identity. We have supported about 150 organizations representing different national minorities. We have had meetings, discussed problems. Actually, what has been raised today has already been discussed during meetings, so this is a familiar situation for us. Some meetings had subject topics to discuss, like the Roma's issues, and I will comment on the situation with this program document. On 7 October 2020, a very important document was adopted, Euroma strategic program, EU 10-year program, was only endorsed on 7 October 2020. After it was endorsed, we in Ukraine published the first draft and started thorough discussion of this draft. Ukraine declares Euro integration in the constitution. We have to be in the same format, on the same way, with certain tendencies in the EU. And to take a start with this document even earlier would be preliminary. In December, after broad public consultation, the strategic was forwarded for discussion. The report on public consultations has been posted on the site, and then all regional and central authorities that deal with the strategies should facilitate for the cabinet of ministers to render a decision. So we are also talking about housing issues, access to education, access to potable water, And the endorsement of such act, particularly if it is interagency, we had 40 agencies that took part in the discussions first time, 42 agencies in the second time. And this draft act should have passed the public discussions before it is endorsed by the subject matter ministry. So it was not possible to initiate such processes before, but this process are determined by specific challenges related to this document, particularly the timing that this EU Roma strategic framework as a document that was adopted in the EU. When Mr. Volodymyr Kondor made comments in April, we had a preliminary meetings with some Roma communities where he took part, and we expected the strategy to be endorsed in May, and then so that we could work on the topical discussions. But in April, when we received the latest resolutions of the interagency endorsement, the rule of procedure of Cabinet of Ministers was changed. According to these new rules of procedure, the strategy may be adopted on the whole. However, the strategy for a specific category of population happens to be such that does not correspond to the rule of procedure. The concern was that there was not final provision included there. And the Cabinet of Ministers was supposed to decide what was going to happen with this strategy and other strategies that at the time of changes to the rules of procedure that came into effect on 23 June. These documents were being at the final stages. Now we are awaiting decision with regard to further steps according to the information available to our service. Probably next week there is going to be a meeting of a government committee that will take a decision regarding our strategy, whether this document can be endorsed as an exception, considering that we had worked for a year on this document, and now to reformat and start processes together would be wrong, would be not right. Or maybe they will propose formatting that may be completed in few days rather than procedures that might take many months. Therefore, I hope that next week, or at least in 2 weeks' time, within 2 weeks' time, we will see how the government sees the way out of this situation with regard to the strategies that has been developed. It's impossible to lose connection with our service because our site is active every day. We have a Facebook page for messages and that would be answered within the same day or even late in the evening. They will be answered too. If you write a question, there is an e-communication that is available, and also there is a telephone line that is available, and those NGOs that have not been consulted us with any issues, please inform us, and we will include you in the schedule of our consultations. So thank you. I would like to thank committee again for this communication, and we will take part in further consultations with regard to this draft law. Thank you. Thank you, Oleno. Please pay attention that during our meetings, many national minority NGOs raised questions about activities of the service. And today you have heard about how effective cooperation with the subject matter authority will proceed. And we will have numerous opportunities to discuss this. Thank you. We have representative of Ministry of Culture, please. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Good afternoon, Dmitry Valeryevich. Yes, this work that has been done by the committee, irrespective of the norms that will or will not be addressed in this version of the law. But it deserves possible score because the communications that happened across regions, they fostered better understanding of the problems of national minorities, like the hotspots. And the minorities can understand the response of Ukrainian authorities to their requests. And the first violin in this process belongs to the Verkhovna Rada and to the author of the draft law. We have experience and background of discussing this document at the level of the government. And there were thoughts expressed about how much this framework law is needed, or many some other norms could be regulated in other legislative acts. Anything good that is being done, they have the right to leave if this law addresses problems or prevents their emergence. This means that this law is needed. On the other hand, we need to analyze that we do not create other problems that may complicate the relationships of national minorities with the government. Therefore, this work is very important to prevent potentially negative impacts. And also, I believe that this draft law needs to envisage the COVID and problems as the inactivities of the public institutions and NGOs have highlighted the institutional support as the most effective form of support. When the state provides support for activities of your organizations, then within the recent 3 years, the grant support such instrument has been effective. And it seems to me that the draft law and the law in the future clearly not only declare but also specify specific principles that will, considering the inclusion of special forms of institutional support in the activities of government authorities, in the plans of their activities, and in the budget. And there should also be information communication both inside national communities and between the communities and the rest of the society. It seems to me that this will be a very practical, concrete, important step that will bring a new level to the perception by national minorities of that they are needed by the Ukrainian state, and will help them to understand that they are have full rights with like equal rights with the citizen public. And therefore, such support should find a place in the law. Also, what is very important is consideration of such things as this learning of the history of the ethnicities and people in universities, how they emerged, for example, those people, including indigenous people, how they developed. I think that we pay little attention to the historic research of the heritage of these peoples. I believe this will be an important step now. That will be extremely important for national minorities and who are have full rights in the Ukrainian society. Also, strategy is important, and understanding the policy and like the issue of assimilation or understanding the process is similar process. In Poland, for example, also political liberalization. I believe that it is the wisdom of legislator to find compromise when we would ensure to preserve our independence and to respond to external challenges and give the opportunity to people who practice their national identities to exercise their rights. And I would like to wish to the committee, to the authors of this draft law, creative work and successful completion to accomplish the assignment of the president and to accomplish the tasks that will enable Ukraine to look directly into the eyes of any European countries and be a model in many things. Thank you. Rostislav Karandev, First Deputy Ministry of Culture. Thank you very much, colleagues. We have worked today 3 hours and 15 minutes. From the very beginning, we agreed that we were going to work for 3 hours. We exceeded a little bit this time. I gave the floor to representatives where it was possible of all organizations, with all respect to all of you. All of you who wanted, you were given the floor before 7. So June you can send email to us your proposals, and I always duplicate this information on my FB page. Please sign up there. I'm Metro Lubinets. I personally comment on messages and questions that have been sent to me. That's how I communicate with representatives of national minorities. I would like to mention that the very position of the president is key. And what Mr. Rostislav was saying, there were 2 ideas. Two thoughts. One, that the law did not require any changes. Another thought that the law should be changed and a new version developed. Now we have started to work actively. Thank you, colleagues. I would be to the maximum with my colleagues at the subject matter committee. We will be considering all of your wishes, but the law will be a consensus among all MPs, and firstly, we need to find 226 MPs that will be ready to vote for it in the first reading and the second reading. Between the readings, we will be able to have a discussion. We are working on the second trip across country. The first one we started in Donetsk Oblast and traveled across all southern Oblast and ended up in Transcarpathian Oblast in Uzhgorod town. Next trip is scheduled to be started in Lugansk Oblast to travel across all northern Oblast and end up our trip in Lviv Oblast in the city of Lviv. And this will be meetings and consultations with national minorities. Don't forget Zhytomyrska Oblast. Zhytomyr Oblast, of course, we won't, because we will be driving across there. Thank you very much, colleagues. Till we meet again, take care. And do not forget that, unfortunately, coronavirus has not disappeared. Thank you.